those of us who work here know it's not always easy to find silence in the day. And yet without it, we lose so much. There's so much that we don't see. There's so much that we don't get to experience. So how do we reconcile the two? How do we reconcile the demands of a busy, hectic life with the spiritual nourishment that we all know that we need that comes through a prayerful silence? Well, that's what the talk will be about today, and it's a great pleasure to welcome Judith Valente back to St. Catharine again. So her and Brother Paul were here last semester, and a beautiful presentation on the art of haiku. And haiku is one of the methods that we can use to stop and take a snapshot of time, rather than always seeing it streaming outside the car window, but to stop and really get a glimpse of what it's like to be human. Okay? And the students in my class know I'm always trying to make the distinction between just thinking and getting information and contemplating. Contemplation requires us to stop and be still, hold something in the mind, and then its deeper nuances, its deeper qualities are revealed to us. So, with that, I'll go ahead and bring Judy up here. She's got several books available there, so if you didn't pick one up last time, now's the great time to do that after the talk. And I'll come up and say just a few words more after the talk. But for now, Judy.
I'm really happy, delighted to be back to St. Catharine's. I've had the privilege in the past year of speaking at places from coast to coast, East Coast to West Coast. And, you know, they all start to run together after a while, but not St. Catharine's. St. Catharine's sticks in my memory, and I think it's because at some point, and perhaps it's due to the wonderful Benedictine sisters, many of whom are here, I think at some point somebody along the line decided that the guiding principle of this college was going to be love and hospitality. And that's certainly felt by the strangers who come here. So thank you for that. I also feel as though I'm only really the warm-up act for Brother Paul. I understand people might be going to Gethsemane a little bit later for Compline, some of the students, which is a wonderful experience. And then next Friday, or in a couple of Fridays, some students will be going perhaps to Thomas Merton's Hermitage. So that will be a wonderful chance to see how a group of modern men are striving to live a life of contemplation, which is just a big, fat, fancy word for trying to figure out what really matters. I speak to you today not out of any great wealth of wisdom that I possess, but out of the poverty of my own struggle to understand what it is to live a more contemplative life and a more meaningful life. But if we're very lucky in life, we arrive at a moment or a series of moments that launch us on a journey of discovery. Now, having grown up in the New York metropolitan area and spent most of my career in the city of Chicago, I could never have imagined my journey of discovery would lead to a place as strange to me as Atchison, Kansas, and to a Benedictine monastery on a hill. But that is where this journey begins. In the spring of 2007, I was feeling very dry in my own spiritual life. Ironically, my husband and I had just published a poetry anthology called Poems to Nourish the Soul. And we began getting requests to speak all over the country about poetry and the spirit, workshops, retreats, things like that. And one of the places that we were invited was Mount St. Scholastica, a Benedictine women's monastery in Atchison, Kansas, in the heart of America's heartland. And my husband and I were to speak both at Benedictine College there and at the retreat center of the monastery. And this visit bookended a very hectic period of travel and speaking for us. So We arrived late one Saturday night at Mount St. Scholastica, and I was feeling exhausted, mentally, physically, and spiritually. In fact, I felt like something of a fraud because I knew I had to stand up the next morning in front of a retreat group and talk about nourishing the soul when I hadn't fed my own soul a decent meal in several weeks. In the morning I was to give the presentation, I had an opportunity to sit alone in the choir chapel at the monastery, this beautiful oak-lined chapel. And all around me were these lovely blue stained glass windows depicting various episodes in the life of Saint Benedict, the founder of monastic life. And I later learned that this was a really unique color blue called Atchison Blue, a blue that was created by the glassmaker just for that monastery, but had also over time been blended into a particular shade by the fierce winds and heat and rain of the Kansas weather. I was sitting alone in this chapel, and silence seemed to saturate the room. And there was this lovely sunlight coming in through the stained glass windows and creating splashes of color on the wall. As I said, silence seemed to saturate this very place. And I happened to look up at the stained glass window in front of me, and there was an image of Saint Benedict with outstretched arms. And around him were some words in Latin: Omni tempore silentio debent studere. So I'm sitting there, and I reached back into my high school and college Latin, and I did a rough translation of Omni tempore silentio debent studere. At all times, cultivate silence. And the paradox that I had been living was suddenly staring me in the face. I had been running all over the country, talking and talking, trying to help other people live a more contemplative life, when what was missing in my own life were moments of silence and solitude, when I could simply listen and be. And without those moments, I was losing drop by drop the inner resources I needed to do the work that I loved well and to cultivate an interior life. How can we build a space in our busy lives for silence and solitude? That's a question I began to ask myself in that moment, though I didn't have any answer for it then. But I began to think this thing called monastic life might have something to teach me, a modern married professional woman, that I couldn't get in all the books lining the bookshelves at Barnes & Noble, telling women like me that we could have it all. You know, I do a lot of spiritual reading, and I had often gone to the desert fathers and mothers for wisdom, the ancient Ammas and Abbas who retreated to the desert to seek God with an undivided heart. Well, there in Atchison, Kansas, in this group of Benedictine women I stumbled upon, I found 145 modern-day Ammas alive and well and living on the Great Plains. One of the first friends I made at Mount St. Scholastica Monastery was then 89-year-old Sister Lillian Harrington. She's now, as of last Friday, 96-year-old Sister Lillian Harrington. And she has this great sense of humor. And she often joked with me. I was at the monastery that first visit for 4 days about growing older and the limitations and the frailties of old age. And I have always had this terrible fear of death from my early childhood. And I think it's because I had parents who were older than me, and they looked like other people's grandparents. And grandparents had this unfortunate habit of dying. And I was always afraid as a child that my parents would die and leave me alone. So I always had this terrible fear of death, to the point where even today I will sometimes wake up in the middle of the night with this terror that I too am someday going to die. And so as I got to know Sister Lillian over the course of these few days, I felt comfortable enough to ask her if at her advanced age she ever thinks about the moment of death. Well, she drilled these steely blue eyes into mine and told me something that I've never forgotten, something that I think about every day now. She said, "I don't think about dying. I think about living." Living mindfully, looking beyond the obvious. It was something these contemplative sisters seemed to do with such ease. It was something I knew I did not want to arrive at my deathbed not having learned how to do. And spending an average of a week a month at this monastery for a period of 3 years. And the sisters were so generous to me, giving me an unprecedented opportunity as a laywoman to enter into the life of the community. And I often think back on that decision that they must have made to let this journalist into their lives. I mean, talk about the proverbial fox in the hen house. But it worked out pretty well. I always had the sense when I visited Mount St. Scholastica that I was entering a deeper reality. And it would start with the beginning of the day, when the sisters would gather for morning praise at dawn. And they would make this moving gesture of running their fingers across their lips. And they would say, "Lord, open my lips, and my mouth shall proclaim your praise." Now these were the first words that they would say every day. And it was a call for praise. And for me, it's a reminder that our days are meant not for grumbling and complaining and criticizing, but our days are meant for praise. The sisters at prayer would also bow to one another from across the aisle. And this really struck me as well, because to bow is totally countercultural in America. We live in a society of the quick handshake, the easy hug, and it's all meant to establish instant parity. But the monastic bow says something quite different. It says, "I see you, and all that is sacred in you. We are all in this together." And I remember how different the person across the aisle would look to me when I raised my head after bowing to them, having acknowledged their presence, their worth, and my own limitedness. The sisters, like the Trappist monks down the road, come together several times a day for community prayer. And you're supposed to drop whatever you're in the middle of and run off to prayers as soon as you hear the bell ring. And I thought, oh no, I'll never be able to do that. That's totally not for me. I'll never be able to stop in the middle of whatever sentence I'm writing on my computer. What I'm doing is much, much too important. But then the bell would ring, and I'd put aside whatever I was doing and bolt down the hallway for prayers, because I didn't want to miss it. I didn't want to miss that time when the community came together. And there was this beautiful sound of all of these women's voices singing and praying as one. When I worked for the Wall Street Journal, Matt didn't mention that, but I was with the Wall Street Journal for eight and a half years in the Chicago and the London bureau. And when I worked in the Wall Street Journal here in America, I had a desk near the window on the 21st floor. And I would come in about 9 o'clock in the morning and proceed to begin typing at my computer and making phone calls and burying myself in whatever was the story of the day. And at some point during the day, I would look up out the window, and it would be dark outside. The day had passed, and I'd missed it. I was like the narrator in one of my favorite poems by A.R. Ammons, who says, "It was May before my attention turned to spring. And my word, I said to the southern slopes, I've missed it." So the narrator travels farther north, where spring isn't quite so far along, in the hope of catching a glimpse of the first blush of the season. He travels north. But make no mistake, the poet says at the end of the poem, it's not that way with all things. Some that go are gone. Pausing periodically for prayer during the day helped reacquaint me with the day's distinct rhythms. I would go to bed at night with a greater sense of having lived that day. And remember Sister Lillian's words, I don't think about dying. I think about living. The rhythm of monastic life is one of the things I miss most when I return to my regular secular life in the work world and the family world. And try as I might to replicate it with these wonderful little books that they have now, This is the Day and Daybreak and all these books where you could follow along with the monastic way of prayer. I couldn't replicate it, try as I might. My schedule is much too hectic. Morning praise might easily turn into midday praise. And when I'm on the road for PBS, we often work till 9, 10 o'clock, sometimes midnight. So evening prayers, vespers, would often turn into midnight prayers. But I wondered what kind of prayer with my hectic schedule could I do? And that's when it occurred to me that prayer didn't have to be separate and distinct moments within my day, but my prayer could be the day itself. When I drive from my home in central Illinois to Chicago, where I frequently work, the 2.5-hour trip becomes a meditation as I pass the corn and soybean farms in the small towns of Towanda and Lexington and Chenoa. And it becomes a prayer for those farmers and for anyone suffering in those small towns that I pass. And when I work at the NPR station where I live, I try to make that work a prayer, something that adds what the novelist Paulo Coelho called something that adds to the soul of the world, what he called the soul of the world. And I still try to pause periodically throughout my day, even if it's just to write a 3-line haiku, a practice that Brother Paul taught me, and which formed the thread of our book, The Art of Pausing. Ironically, we can pause and still be productive, often even more productive. I love the story of the African bushmen who take periodic pauses while they're out on safari. They stop and listen for the beating of the heart. And they say they are waiting for their souls to catch up with the rest of them on the journey. And I think sooner or later, we all need our souls to catch up with us on the rest of our journey. Can we take time for pausing, remembering that we can pause and still be productive? Perhaps the two most important words I learned in my 3 years of visiting this monastery are another two words in Latin, conversatio morum. And they simply refer to a vow that Benedictines take. Roughly translated, it means conversion of morals, conversion of life, or conversion to the monastic way of life. You sometimes hear it put. But I like the definition of conversatio given to me by my friend Sister Thomasita Holman. Conversatio as a constant turning, a continuous conversation with life. I like this notion of turning because turning connotes change. And I found when I was at the monastery that there was so much about myself that I wanted to change, not the least of which is my hot Sicilian temper, which has been the source of most of my problems and many of my disappointments in life. And I found I liked myself much more in the days that I was at the monastery, because when I was there, I was calm, I was patient. I didn't blow my stack at other people. And one day I had been home, just a few days from a 2-week extended visit to the monastery. And I argued with my husband. Now, Brother Paul knows my husband, my beautiful husband. He's just about the most easygoing man in the world. But I managed to have with him a stupid, totally unnecessary argument. And I got angry with myself. And I called Sister Thomasita, and I said, how is it that I can live conversatio when I'm at the monastery, but I can't seem to live conversatio in my everyday life around the people that I love the most in the world? And she told me something that I'll always remember. She said, you are living conversatio. Your struggle, that's the conversatio. And that gave me hope. Hope that I didn't have to be perfect. I just had to be human. Now I look upon conversatio not as some sort of goal that I achieve, but rather conversatio works on the same principle as a Russian doll. As soon as you enter into one door of the heart, it's time to go through another and another. Where are the pieces in our lives in need of conversatio? That continuous conversation with life. My early visits to Mount St. Scholastica were mostly a time of listening and observing and getting to know the individual sisters. And I admit that I first approached these visits very much like a reporting assignment, trying to remain the dispassionate journalistic observer. When I was a young reporter at the Washington Post, that was my first job in journalism before the Wall Street Journal, one of the first bits of advice that a senior woman editor gave me was never let them see you cry. No matter what happens, never cry in the newsroom. And I never did on any of my assignments or in the newsroom. But at Mount St. Scholastica, I would have these long, involved conversations with the sisters. And then I would go back to my guest room and weep uncontrollably because I was so touched by the stories that they told. and the lives that they'd led. I'll never forget the June morning I first walked into the room of Sister Kathleen Egan. And she was seated in a wheelchair in the monastery's assisted living wing, and she was dressed in this crisp navy blue suit. She looked so fragile that I feared if I just touched her, she might crumble beneath my hands. But she had these beautiful, vivid eyes that were oceanic blue and seemed to be lit from something within. Her first words to me were anything but feeble. She said, "I want to tell you one thing, and I want you to remember this. War is the greatest evil. War is demonic." And before I learned anything else about Kathleen Egan, that she is the sister of the famous peace activist and author Eileen Egan, that she was a personal friend of a close personal friend of Mother Teresa and Dorothy Day, a correspondent of Thomas Merton, and an author herself, before I knew any of that, I learned that Sister Kathleen Egan is unequivocally, immovably opposed to violence of any sort, whether it's the death penalty, hunting, war, or the conceal and carry weapons laws we now have in all 50 states. And I remember telling Sister Kathleen about a segment that I had recently seen, I think it was on 60 Minutes. And there were some young men being interviewed who were obviously very well educated and spoke English very well. And they told the interviewer that America is evil. Americans deserve to die. And the interviewer said, "All Americans?" And these young men said, "Yes, all Americans." And I asked Sister Kathleen, what are we supposed to do with that? What do we make of that? Don't we have the right to defend ourselves against people who want to kill us just because? And she said something I've never forgotten. She said, "Look more deeply into the question. Ask yourself what's causing those young men to hate Americans. Address those causes." Later, I had a chance to go down into the archives in the basement of the monastery and pull out this cardboard box that contained all of Sister Kathleen Egan's personal papers. And here was the paper trail of her work for Benedictines for Peace, on Atchison's War on Poverty Council. Here were the letters she wrote to consecutive Kansas governors opposing the death penalty. But what really struck me was there was a "to whom it may concern" letter requesting that upon her death, any funds left from her book royalties be donated to the poor, and that all of her bodily organs, including her eyes, those beautiful eyes, be donated to the University of Kansas Medical Center for research. And I realized that Sister Kathleen's commitment to nonviolence formed part of a seamless thread. It stemmed not from any set of political beliefs, but from living a principled life based on the Gospels. Until that point, in my quest to learn more about a life of contemplation, I had been focused solely on my own personal transformation. But Sister Kathleen helped me see that personal transformation counts for little if it doesn't extend outward and ease the plight of others. Thomas Merton spoke about the need for contemplation and action. Contemplation alone, he said, doesn't feed the hungry, teach the uneducated, clothe the poor, or stop the violence. Toward the end of his life, he wrote, "We must work together as Americans and Christians, as brothers and builders. I with my books and prayers, you with your work and prayers. Separately, we are incomplete. Together, we are strong with the strength of God." Sister Kathleen had discovered that long ago. How can we find a balance, a way to blend contemplation and prayer and action in this wounded world we live in? I learned so many more practices at Mount St. Scholastica Monastery, far too many to tell you about in this time frame that we have together today. But there are practices that I can easily, and anyone can easily, incorporate into their daily life. Simple practices. For example, the sisters would say, before you open your mouth to speak, ask yourself 3 questions. Is it true? Is it kind? And is it necessary? And I can't tell you how many times pausing to ask myself those 3 little questions has saved me from myself. And then there was this old tradition at the monastery, which they don't practice anymore, but I wish they would, and in fact, I wish the whole world would. And it was when 2 or 3 or more sisters were called upon to complete a task together, they would first bow to one another and say, "Have patience with me." And I've often thought how much more pleasant my work days at PBS would be if before we headed out on an assignment, I would bow to the producer, bow to the cameraman, bow to the audio technician, and they to me, and we would ask each other to please have patience with our human frailties. I'll just read now, if the book doesn't fall down again, I'll just read now from the ending of the book that I wrote about my journey with these Benedictine sisters in Atchison. And nobody's fallen asleep yet. Those chairs are so comfortable. What then can be made of this journey? I wish I could say my visits to the monastery miraculously cured my bad temper or healed my many wounded relationships. But that would not be conversatio. Conversatio isn't a sudden tectonic shift. It is more like the steady etching of water on a shoreline. It is the work of everyday life. And yet, I have changed, if only in infinitesimal ways. I am rowing, Anne Sexton wrote in one of her best poems. I am rowing, though the oarlocks stick and are rusty, and the sea blinks and rolls like a worried eyeball, and the wind pushes me back. But there will be a door, and I will open it, and God will be there, like an island I had not rowed to. And as fine as it is to reach our destination, we know from Odysseus and all the great heroes of myth that it is the journey that matters most. It is only when we put down our oars and stop moving forward that we grow feeble and die inwardly. I used to think of monasteries as a hopeless throwback to the past, a case of let the last monk or sister standing turn out the lights. Now I see them as windows to the future, a future we desperately need in our society, one that stresses consensus over competition, simplicity over consumption, service over self-aggrandizement, quietude over the constant chatter of Twitter and Facebook and the other white noise of our lives. Thomas Merton once said, "There will always be a place for monasteries because the world will always need signs of contradiction." The past few decades have been dominated by technology innovators who built better, faster systems of information delivery. But information isn't wisdom. Every age needs meaning makers. Meaning makers point us to what C.S. Lewis called the real world. That's what the Benedictines and the Dominicans have been doing for thousands of years. As the MasterCard ad says, priceless. In many ways, I feel as if my entire past has led me to this monastery on the hill. I always sensed whenever I visited there, I was crossing into a deeper reality. Now I believe in something else too. The real cloister or enclosure is the heart, the Cistercian abbess Gail Fitzpatrick once wrote. I believe in a monastery of the heart. That is what I hope I have been building. This story ends with me still building. Thank you.
How resonant. I mean, I've got a feeling this will not be Judy's last time to St. Catherine's, because she's telling our story. I mean, this is it. How many, when I think of your stories with the Benedictines and mine here with the Dominicans, it's the same thing. And the college is trying to live that tension, that conversation with this contemplative heritage and all the struggles and challenges that our lovely students can sometimes bring with us. But that's it. That's the way that it's transmitted. That's the way that this vision, this way of living is kept alive. Judy's going to hang out for a while. I want to open the floor for some questions, but she's going to hang out and sign some books. If anybody wants to buy books, she'll hang out and sign some books. And then after that, we're going to take a trip to Gethsemane. So for you guys who have never been, please come with us. It'll be a nice contemplative journey through the country. I'll drive. You can just look out of the window and see spring pop into being. And we'll go to a house saturated with silence, where you feel that silence, and Brother Paul will be our guide there. So please hang around, and we'll take a trip to Gethsemane and after we finish here. But now I just want to open it up for some questions. Any questions
Comments,
for
really.
Judy? Comments or questions?
This is rather trivial, but the windows at Atchison are by Emile Fry of St. Louis.
Yes.
And he also did the windows at Gethsemane Abbey.
Is that right?
Yes.
That's why
Now-
I love them so much, I guess.
Well,
Wow.
we don't have
Didn't
blue. I mean,
No,
blue is
you
not
have
the
gray,
feature.
gray and
Yeah, it's
white
a variety of
and-
colors. Also, there's a window or two at Christ Church Cathedral in Louisville, the Episcopal Cathedral, and also the Presbyterian Chapel, the chapel at the Presbyterian Seminary has windows by William Schickel, who did our windows, but I'm pretty sure, William Schickel was the son-in-law of Emile Fry.
Mm.
Yeah, Emile Fry's daughter was married to, so it all kind of works
yeah,
together.
All these cross currents and interesting, yeah. That's yeah. Thanks for saying that. That was real. Yeah, that's definitely noticed the windows at Gethsemane. Last night at Vespers at Gethsemane, there was these 8 coronas of light behind the monks coming in from the light coming in from the stained glass windows. And it was so ethereal and otherworldly. It was really wonderful. Yeah. Well, I'd like to hear your comments, if there was anything that resonated with you in your lives, the narrative of your lives. Especially thank you to the students for coming. It's so good of you to come. Thank you. Because, you know, I didn't hear any of this stuff, you know, till much later in my life. And now I say, why didn't somebody tell me this when I was 21? You know? So I love to speak to young people and to students. Yes, sir.
I feel a strong correlation with the second law of thermodynamics, entropy. That as a society, we're just really focused on being busy, just increasing, you know, pedal to the metal, go, everything will be solved. And if you start, you know some physics and realize you're going to get more chaos, you're throwing more energy, get more disorder. You know, some of the solution to the energy crisis isn't getting more energy, it's stopping and assessing efficiency and avoiding the chaos that's causing more problems.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up about, you know, cutting, the idea is not to take more energy out of the universe, but maybe slow down a little bit yourself. And the Benedictines have a saying, succissa verescit. Cut back, it will grow stronger. And for somebody like me, who's always running around trying to do 5 different things at once and be all things to all people, who doesn't know how to say no, you know, succissa verescit is a good motto to remember, because we have to cut back. We have to periodically cut back in our lives to refocus on what's essential. And that's why a lot of the monasteries will have grapevines, because grapevines are a great example of that. The vines will just grow and grow and grow on their own, but they won't produce anything of value if there isn't a vine dresser to cut them back periodically, so that, you know, a certain number of shoots can get the nutrients and the sunlight that they need to produce the grapes. So that is something that I have to remind myself of. Cut back, it will grow stronger. Thanks for your question. Yes?
I'm just curious about what you do when you contemplate.
Mm-hmm.
Can you describe something that would be helpful to us?
Yeah, you know, I have a full-time job, and I really just stop sometimes, and I pause, and I will listen. You know, not so much even look around as I will stop and I will listen. And then I'll look around at what's happening. And there's always something happening, you know, around me. There might be a praying mantis, you know, on a branch outside my window or something. Or there might be a cardinal singing. And I'll stop, and sometimes I'll record my haiku of the day for that. You know, I still try to write a 3-line poem, a haiku every day. So I find myself often when I am really in the midst of a lot of activity and feeling a lot of pressure, just pausing and emptying my mind, just listening, and then looking around me. And you know, those few minutes is like taking a cat nap or something for me. So that's what I do. I mean, I don't have the luxury of, you know, sitting home at the same time every day with a nice candle burning and some incense and, you know, opening my prayer book. You know, I just don't. I'm just involved in too many activities. But I have to take those moments where I can in my life, like a waitress. I say in Atchison Blue, you know, you have to be like the waitresses who know in the down times, you know, to sit down and put their feet up, you know. They know how to do that. They know how to grab those moments. So that's what I do, yeah. Yes?
I just want to make a statement. I came to your last presentation in November, and I'm from Kansas.
Oh.
So I didn't buy The Art of Pausing. I bought Atchison Blue.
Mm-hmm.
Was very intrigued and loved the book. Shortly after, a friend of mine who is the president of the Visitors Bureau in the city where I had been living wrote to me and said her daughter and grandchildren were moving to Atchison. And when she went there, she saw that wonderful monastery. They are not Catholic. And she said, wrote to me and said, do you know if it's possible if we could visit that monastery? So I wrote back and I said, of course. And I'm sending you a book about it. So I sent her the copy of Atchison Blue, of which both she and her daughter and her two grandsons, particularly who are in high school, appreciated very much reading before they went to the monastery. And they have been there and visited the sisters, and it's
Yeah.
great how
I'm
it's spreading.
so glad, Sister, you mentioned that, because something I forget to say is that anybody can visit a monastery. I liken it to being a car going to the mechanic shop for a tune-up. I mean, anybody can visit Gethsemane. All you have to do is call ahead and see if they have a guest room available. So, anybody can go and visit and pray with the sisters and the monks, any monastery in the world, really. So it's something that we all can do. Yeah. Anything else, I always like to ask people if there's one thing that they might take home with them tonight from what we discussed here today. One idea or one point. I remember Alona, after we talked about the art of pausing, Alona started to send all her wonderful haiku to us, and so I know that some things sort of resonate more than others with people. Yes.
I think the idea of solitude and silence is so very kind to our soul and then therefore our being. Just always strikes me as how forgiving and kind that is.
Yes, and I think we have to particularly guard our silence and solitude if we're in the younger generation, because you're plugged in all the time, right? Am I right? I mean, there's always texting going on. There's Netflix. There's all this stuff at your Facebook and Twitter and all this stuff. So I think it's even going to be harder for the younger generation to carve out that time, because I don't know enough about that stuff, Twitter and all that, to get real caught up in it. I've got a small presence on Facebook because of my books, but I think the young people really have to figure out your way with silence and solitude in a way that, for example, my generation didn't have to. So.
I like your before you speak, but I don't think you usually have time to go through those three things before you speak. It just comes out, so you've got to do something before that.
Well, yeah, the
that
pause
doesn't
is
come
important.
out, because what comes out is not that. I would think, I often think, is this true? Somebody says something, is this true? And then, but I don't notice. I think, well, is this kind, and is it necessary? I'm sure I don't go through those steps, so I found that kind of interesting.
Yeah.
And the other is, you see so much of this now, those contrasts between simplicity and consumerism and this and that, the culture and the counterculture, and I think that's really important to keep looking at.
Yeah, I think the is it necessary is the hard one. And I have stepdaughters. Need I say more to those of you who are in blended families? And I have to say, it's really helped me in those tough, tense relationships, because I just say, is it necessary for me to complain to my husband one more time about them? And it's really been a big help. Because I just say, what, it's not necessary. It's there are other things for me to talk about and think about. One thing I didn't talk about, which might interest the students too, is I just told you about my fear of death, and one of the most moving experiences was watching the dying process of the dying, death, and burial of one of the sisters. Now, I don't know if the Dominicans have this, but what really struck me was that none of the sisters dies alone. Unless she's away from the monastery and has a heart attack or dies suddenly in her sleep or something like that. No one dies alone. The sisters keep this 24-hour vigil at her bedside. And they also have this tradition that when a sister dies, they do storytelling, and they tell about a sister's life. And so the sister that they allowed me to, to see this whole process through with, her name was Sister Phyllis. And she wasn't, she wasn't an author like Sister Kathleen or a well-known speaker or anything like that. In fact, she taught reading to school children. And her cousin got up and told a story about Sister Phyllis that really stayed with me, that Sister Phyllis was on a home visit to see her family. And when it was time for the cousin to drive her back to the monastery, the cousin noticed that Sister Phyllis wasn't wearing her coat. And the cousin said, "Well, Phyllis, where's your coat?" She had given it away to the family's housekeeper. And the cousin said to Sister Phyllis, "Well, didn't you say that was your new coat? You just got that coat?" And Sister Phyllis said, "That's okay. I can get another one." And I think about that story a lot in relation to some of the stories that we read in the newspaper today about CEOs that are earning 500 times what their workers are earning. And there was an obituary just a while back about someone that I had covered at the Wall Street Journal, an investment banker who engineered all kinds of mergers and acquisitions, became a multi-billionaire, and died of a heart attack at the age of 61. And I remember thinking, $1 billion or 1 red cent isn't going to change the fact that we're all someday going to die. And yet, here it was, Sister Phyllis, a woman who never had a personal bank account, who owned no possessions except what she owned in common with her community. It was Sister Phyllis who felt rich enough and secure enough to give away her only coat. And it makes me think of this quote, and I'll see if I can remember it by memory, of Karl Rahner, where he says, and I'm speaking to the students, because I know the sisters know this, but he says, "The only thing that we have at the moment of death, the only thing we can take with us at the moment of death is I myself, as I was in the ultimate depths of my own heart, a heart that was either full of love or full of spite and hidden selfishness." So I think that's a kind of a good measure to think about living and live our lives by. Anybody else want to have a comment or?
Judy, we're asked to start classes with a moment of some kind of silence or contemplation. What would you suggest would be a good exercise for students who are rushing into class to get them to settle down before we begin?
Well, just what you did today, I think, was excellent. Just asking people to quiet themselves, center themselves, and just try to empty the mind for those few minutes, and just sit, say nothing, do nothing, be still. Anything else?
Good.
Oh, there's one more comment.
One more hand up.
I was just thinking of what to say to someone. Recently I read about not just being silent, but needing silence. To me, that is far more than what most of us experience. What does that mean to really meet silence? It's a long road.
It's a journey. That is a journey.
Yes.
Well, thanks for that comment. Well, thanks everybody. I really appreciated spending some time with you. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.